And now I've changed some of the settings. I've moved over those density over to the color. We can see that showing up a lot better. You can also see a lot more now some of our lines that we have created by using the cracks or the drought as we had for our filter controlling our ratio. So we can see those really showing up. So you might want to change it to something else depending on the look you're going for. But overall, when this is animated, it should look pretty good. I've also modified our overall gradient map, so we can take a look at those changes as well. So just go ahead and close this out. We're going to go back to frame 1, open up the material editor, right mouse click, edit color map, and now we can see the new color map option. What I did was I took our first key color that we had and moved it over. I also made it more of a brighter orange. And then before that, I made a new key color right at the beginning that was kind of a darker orange. And now we've got just a little more variation. I've also changed the color to a little more yellow within the center key color. And we could do that even more if needed. But most of the luminosity settings that we have will actually take care of changing that to a nice bright yellow. And I've also adjusted our first key color as well, just a slight amount. So I'm just going to close that out. And now just to finish this up, we're going to take a look at some of our other options where we have our rotation. And we're going to be animating these over time. And that way we can get a much more realistic looking flame. So first thing I'm going to do is just turn on rotation at frame 1. We're going to go to edit, and that's going to open up our options. Now we have both rotation and twist options. And right now these are just our initial settings. Basically if we use twist or rotation, it's going to stay that way throughout the entire animation until we go to our last keyframe and then alter these values. And then we'll have a very nice blend between all of our different settings. So right now, what I just want to do is adjust some of our twisting settings. And I'm going to change our X to our Z, and just give it a little bit of a twist. And our Y to our Z, I'll go a little bit negative with it. And then our rotation, I'm going to rotate on the Z just a slight amount. But I don't want to be rotating on our X or our Y, just because I don't want to throw off the direction of our flames. If you're going to be creating more of a wind, or if you need to replicate sort of a wind, then what you can do is adjust the Y or the X to specify the direction of your wind and how your flames are being affected by it. I'm just going to close this out. Another thing you can do is increase your velocity of material origin along a specific value, along with still having your Z. And that way you can move upward, but you can still move to other directions a little bit better. You can get some pretty neat effects that way. So now I'm going to click OK. And we can see those new rotation options and twisting options, giving us a little bit different look for our fire. And now we want to go all the way to our last keyframe. We're going to open up the material editor, click on Edit for turbulence, and now we can make some adjustments. We can change the scale of our turbulence, and once we make that first edit, it's going to ask us if we'd like the material to become animated. We're going to click Yes. And now we're working on keyframe animation for setting these values. So we can adjust the amplitude. So if we want more of this material turbulence showing up, we can adjust their harmonics just a little. I'm going to close that, and now we're going to go to our rotation, and now we can change our twisting. I'm going to change our X to our Z a little bit more, and our Y to Z, bring it back a little bit more, and our Z up in rotation, I'm just going to move that up a few degrees. And now all of these settings, and this basically goes for any setting you're using, these are not exact values for everything you're going to be using. Because sizes change throughout different objects, different types of fire, and what you're working on, none of these values will be exactly the same. But by using very similar settings, you can still produce on a global scale of what it is you're working with. And you can always change the overall scale of your object depending on what it is you're working on. But of course, for different shapes, certain settings do matter, like your fuzziness will affect certain objects different ways, really depending on their overall shape. So that's definitely one thing to keep in mind, is that don't always just use the same settings, also vary it a little, and there's a lot of different options because of that. So we're going to click OK, and now we have those extra animated options in there, where we have our turbulence changing over time, and our rotation and twist changing over time. And we can scrub through our animation and take a look at our preview that's showing up. And I'm also going to just render out a very quick preview so we can see it on the bottom. Another thing to keep in mind is that the more complex our nodes become and our functions for creating our fire, the longer it's going to take to render. Because if we take a look now at our old fire that we had on the bottom, this actually rendered fairly quickly because we didn't have any combiner nodes and no mixing between noise and fractal and different things like that. But now that we're using a much more complex function for both color and density, it takes a lot longer to render. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is the more complex your fire looks, it is just going to take a lot longer to render it. So let's go ahead and just render out this preview on the bottom, and then we can take a look at the overall movement and animation of our fire. And now our preview is finished rendering, and I've actually increased or decreased the amount of frames that we have per second for our preview, so we can see a lot bigger changes between each of the frames. But if I just scrub through, we can take a look, and we can see that we have a very realistic looking fire animation. And you'll be able to see the finished rendered example as a movie file, and you can find that on our website. So now you can right mouse click and save this material, and then you can apply this to other objects. Of course, certain settings will need to be changed, and if we save this right now, it's also going to save as a 5-second animation. So it will always be a 5-second animation. If you remove your keyframes that you have at 5 seconds, basically for our rotation and turbulence, then you'll be able to extend this animation as long as you need it. Or what you can do is just adjust your keyframes. And there's a couple of ways we could do that. We can even do that with our scene that we currently have right now. If we go over to the left over here, next to our time, we can have our properties displayed and also our splines. So let's show our properties, and we're also going to show our splines. I'm going to need to resize our viewport so we can see these curves. If we take a look, we have our animated material, and we can see that showing up. Now, I didn't name our material, so I'm going to go back to frame 1 and double click and give this a name. And we're going to call this just fire. And we can click OK. And now we can see our fire has shown up. We also have the default, which is part of our cylinder that we have from before. So we can either delete that from the scene if you want, just to clear it up. But if we take a look, select our fire, we can now see under curve that we have fire. And this material is showing up as a curve. Now keep in mind, this current color of our curve is set to a gray, and we can't really see to edit our curve. So we want to click on this color, and we can change this to anything that we want, but I'm going to select just kind of a brighter orange, something that's really going to show up in contrast to our gray. And now this curve can be edited to modify our keyframe-based changes. And once again, our keyframe-based changes, if we select our object and take a look, under lighting and effects, our turbulence and rotation are what's being changed and what's based on keyframe. Our velocity of material origin has stayed the same, and it's going to be like that throughout the entire animation. So we don't need to worry about affecting these values at all. But once we start modifying the curve, what we're changing is basically our blend between our starting turbulence and our ending turbulence, and our starting rotation and ending rotation. So we can click OK. And now in most cases, a linear curve will work just fine. But if you want more of a gradual blend, and maybe something a little more erratic, we can adjust these curves. So if we click on our last curve point, you can see we get these splines that are available, and now we can adjust our overall curve and how we blend through these different keys. And it works just like a lot of our other filters, where basically the high point that we're seeing, which is represented by a frame value, where we can see 5 is the line that we're on. And if we go down to the bottom, we can see that 0 is our starting frame. So our keys, our original keys at 0 for the frames we had set for that rotation and the turbulence, and then we're slowly changing to our keys that we have set for our rotation and turbulence at 5 seconds. And this is not based on frames, it's based on seconds. So what we can do is change how quickly we want to reach those keys. So if we wanted to reach those keys that we have set at 5 much quicker, we can adjust our curve. And now once we hit around 4 seconds, because we can see everything lined up, we'll immediately hit those keys that we have set for 5. We could also do it the other way, where we have a nice blend. And if we select our first curve, we could even bring that up, and that way we're blending in and out. And it's just that little bit of extra fine-tuning. Now for something like this, I wouldn't suggest going up and down, just because our rotation will get a little erratic. But if you do it enough times, then you'll have some really nice looking flames. So you just kind of want to play around with that until you get it to a point where it looks like realistic fire. So I'm just going to move these back into our almost default position. We do still have a little bit of a change. And if we right mouse click on these points, you can see that we have a lot of different settings. We can base this on a numerical input, smooth constant, weighted, linear, step. Right now it's set to custom because we were modifying it within the curves. We can also go to our curve options, whether or not we'd like to show our grid. We could zoom to the extents, our time extents, and our value extents. And then we can modify and adjust our curves. If we right mouse click, the way we view our timeline, and everything kind of moves together, which is really nice because that way we can tell exactly where we're at in our animation. And every single material is going to have its own set of curves, so if you're working with multiple materials, you will see separate curves for each material. And I just reset that back to normal just by right mouse clicking on each of our points and setting it to linear. With custom, then we have the option to edit this, although we have that option anyway, and once we start moving it, it will change it to custom. But if you need to reset these back to linear values, all you need to do is select the point you'd like to change, right mouse click on it, and you can change that to linear. We also have the step modes, ease in, ease out, and just a lot of these different options available for modifying these automatically without actually going in and modifying each individual curve. And with the properties open, we also have the ability to modify our keyframe. We can select, you can see this nice little timeline right here And this gives us the ability to select this point, and we can drag this in and out. And what that will do is change where our keyframe is at. So if we don't want it at 5 seconds anymore, maybe we want it at 6, we can click on this and drag it over to 6. Or we can bring it in so it reacts much faster. So there's a lot we can do with these different curve options, and they're really useful. But there's one last thing I want to take a look at just before we finish up this section. And that is, typically with fire, we'll have blue flames on the bottom. Now this can be done in a couple of different ways. And it really depends on the ease of their creation. I'm going to hide our properties and hide our curves. So we're just focusing on our scene plus our preview. And one way we could create blue flames on the bottom is to use a combiner node with our current color, and we could have a blue map that's set up and a blue gradient, and then we could base that on our altitude. Now the only problem with that is what we had before, where we're moving our altitude with our velocity changes. And now that doesn't always happen, and there's specific ways of changing settings to really get that effect. But the easiest way to really get those blue flames is just to copy our current meta blob that we have, and we could resize it and reposition it, and then just change the color. And that way, both of our volumetric materials will show through each other. And all we really need to do is adjust some rotation options so they're not exactly the same material. So let's just do that really quick. We're going to select our meta blob, which we can also change the name if we needed to, but I'm going to Control-C to copy, Control-V to paste, and now we have MetaBlob 1 showing up as our second MetaBlob. Let's make some modifications to this. We're going to change this to our sizing options, and we're just going to scale this down because we want this only to really be affecting the bottom of our object. And now we can already see them blending together. And that's another neat way to increase flame definition. It's just by copying, even if we stuck with the current values. But I'm going to move this down now towards the bottom. So now we're affecting the lower regions. And actually this is going just a little bit below what we currently have, so I can move that up. And that's basically because the way we squished it down. And I'm just going to do a little bit of a size change again on our Z-axis, just to shrink that. Go back to our move it down on the Z, and now we're just along that bottom section. So now what we can easily do is just go and change our gradient map for this next material. I'm going to double click, and I want to change this name to fire_blue. And that way, if we're working with curves, it'll be a lot easier to tell which surface we're working on. Go to our volumetric color, and now we can change our gradient map. And we can either load in one of the existing ones and modify it, or we can create an entirely custom one. But before I do that, I'd like to be able to see specifically what we're working on. So I'm going to go back to our first meta blob. We can right mouse click on it. We're going to click Hide from Render. So now we're only going to see our second meta blob and our cloned object, and we can see that on the bottom. So now we don't have to worry about those interactions interfering with each other while we're trying to modify this specific surface. So we'll double click on our preview to go back into our advanced material editor. And now we can either right mouse click and load, and now we can use sunset skies, certain terrain editor maps, and a lot of these different available options. Since they're blue and they already kind of have the options that we need, we can select one of these. But I'm just going to modify my existing gradient map. So I'm going to right mouse click, go to Edit Color Map, and now we can start changing these colors. So we're going to select our first key point, our key color, which is currently our darker orange, and we want to change that to a darker blue. And click OK. And we'll let that refresh so we can take a look. And we might need to close that out first. But we can start to see flecks of blue kind of showing up. But I'm going to go into our next key color now, which is really going to determine this blue. So we'll click on that. And we want to select the right blue color to really show that. And just click OK. Now we have that showing up. So we need to go to our middle key color now, and we're going to change that to a lighter blue. And then I want our last key color to be a very light blue, and almost a white. Click OK. Now let's take a look. Now typically we're not going to want this much definition and really this much blue, because usually the flames aren't entirely blue along the bottom, and they're really not this dense. So we're going to go to our color and density, and I'm going to reduce our overall density. And we'll just let that refresh, and we can take a look. And now we can just see a nice hint of those blue flames. And now if we move on to the Lighting and Effects tab, we can either choose to change our rotation and turbulence so it's a little bit different, or we can keep it the same. And there's advantages and disadvantages to both. The advantage to keeping the settings exactly the same is that our flames will match up the way they do now. So they're basically the same flames that we had before, but shrunk down. And that way, once the rotation is the same, the flames will start to move upward a little more correctly. Now, one of the disadvantages is that sometimes it doesn't look right. In some cases, and in most cases, it will look really good, and it will match up, but not always. So you might need to change that and alter it just a little, which we can easily do by going just at the beginning of the animation where we're at right now, and we can adjust our rotation. And I don't think we really need to worry about the turbulence too much. It's mostly the rotation. So we could edit our rotation and change our twist and rotation options, and that way we're starting at a different point, and then we can just compensate for those overall changes at our last frame. So I'm going to click OK. And now let's turn back on our other meta blob. And now we can look at the blending between the two. So we'll right mouse click on our first meta blob, turn off hide from render, and we'll let that refresh, and we can see exactly what the two materials look like together. And now we can see just the hint of blue in there. For the most part, our first meta blob, because of its density settings, are really sort of overpowering our new blue that we have in there. And we can also see some distortion once these two objects are together. And that can also cause some problems. So I'm going to make a few modifications to try to cut down that distortion, and then we're going to go and edit that color. I'm going to select our meta blob 2, or meta blob 1, which is our second one, and our blue flames, and I'm going to move it just a little bit below our current surface. And now we can start to see a little bit better what's going on, and a little less distortion, where we had the rim, and we can still sort of see that showing up. So what I'm also going to do is go back to our sizing changes, and I'm going to size this on our X and our Y, and just stretch it out a little bit so it extends sort of around the outside, and just pull it up a little bit on our Z to stretch it. And now we can see more of those blue flames on the bottom. It starts to look a little better. Let's make some modifications. We're going to go to our main fire object, first meta blob, go to our color and density tab, and reduce our overall density so we can see through our flames a little bit better, which will also give us a more realistic looking appearance, because typically flames you can see through them for the most part. And we can see that showing up, and click OK. Go into our blue flame object now, go to our material, and we can increase our density and have that show up. And I'm just going to increase our density a little bit more. And also increase our fuzziness. And a lot of this distortion and this line we're seeing is because when we look at a volumetric material, and depending on how we're looking at it and the direction we're looking at, it starts to blend the volumes together and really kind of lights it differently. So if we look at this from a different angle, we're going to notice a little bit of a different effect. And actually it looks like it's a little too bright, so I'm going to turn our density back down. So that can definitely be a drawback to this method, but really depending on how far away you are from the fire, and of course the way the motion works and your motion blur settings, you can sometimes get away with this and you really won't end up seeing that overall effect. Just like how, because we were using that drought noise node or fractal to control our ratio, we had those really sharp areas, but if we take a look at the renders, they kind of blend together, and with certain motion blurring you won't even notice it. So I'm just going to click OK. So I'm going to delete our current blue flame object and just highlight it, select it, and hit delete. And we're going to take a look at another option. What I'm going to do is just load in a point light. And we can position this at the bottom of our object. We want it to go inside just a little. And we currently have a lens flare on here, so we're going to need to just turn that off. And now we have just the light showing up. We're going to change our color to a blue. It may need to be just a little bit brighter. And now we can turn on volumetric lighting. Now immediately it's going to be a very large glow. So we can go to Edit Volumetric Light. And now because we're working with a very small scene and a very small light, we need to decrease our intensity to a very small amount. If you were working with a much bigger object, then we wouldn't really have to worry about this as much. We're going to bring this down to 0.09 right now and click OK. And now we can see we can barely see that at all, so we might need to bring that up a little bit higher. Let's try 0.24. And that setting might be a little too high. If we could just bring that 1.17. And now we want to vary it just a little, so we can click on Show Smoke or Dust and Light Beam. I'm also going to turn off Cast Shadows and Volume, and that way our volumetric material isn't affecting it. And now we can either use just this current function, or we can copy our density function from our volumetric material that is creating our flames, and we could paste that in there, and that way they'll match up. I'm just going to leave it at this right now and click OK. And then we get a little bit of a variation where we can see all of these different flecks. Now it looks like our overall setting for our volumetrics needs to be brought down so it's not affecting such a large area, but we can easily use a point light on the bottom just to create a little bit of a blue look to the bottom. Even though it won't look completely realistic, it is definitely something that is doable. So I'm just going to delete this point light, and we'll go back to our regular flames that we had. And now to finish this up, I'm just going to take a look at a couple of different rendering options for adjusting our quality of our flames. We can go to our main material, making sure we're at frame 0. And like I was saying before, we have our quality boost, where we have faster and better. And the higher we go, the more smooth of an object we're going to get. But we might not necessarily need that option. So we have some other options as well that we can use. And I'm just going to exit out of that. And we're going to right mouse click and go to our render options. And we're currently set to broadcast, which already has a bit of motion blur on. And you could see that in our rendered frames, and also with the single frames I had before that I was rendering in the broadcast mode. But if we go to user settings, we can set this up specifically. You can see we have depth of field and enable motion blurring. I'm going to go to edit. And right now we have our hybrid 2.5D, which is really going to give you the best motion blur. And then we have our number of passes. The more passes we have, the better our overall motion blur is going to look. But this is also how many times it needs to be rendered, and basically how many times I'll have to render over and over and over the same surface in order to get that specific motion blur look. So you'll want to adjust these settings to really see what is going to work specifically for your fire. But if you're working on an overall animation, then you don't want to work specifically with just your fire, but your overall scene, and then adjust your quality specifically for just the material. But we currently have this set to 5 right now. And we also want to take a look. We have advanced effects quality. And now within just the regular render options, we can adjust from faster to better, which is just our overall effects quality, which will have to do with many different settings within View, but it will affect our volumetric materials. We could set up custom settings if we want, where we can adjust adaptive sampling and a lot of these other options, and then we'll also be able to adjust our volumetrics within here as well. And then we have our object anti-aliasing. If we click on Edit, we can see the options for this. Optimize is something you're typically going to want to stick with. Systematic will calculate each pixel, and it will take a very long time to render, and it's really something you only want to use for individual frames and not animation. Our anti-aliasing strategy is currently set to automatic. We also have crisp, sharp, soft, and blurred, and this will affect our overall look of our entire scene. But we can usually leave this at automatic since we have our motion blur settings on. If you're working with single frames, then you might want to adjust these to maybe blur out some of the grain that we have. We could also do a soft, and then blurred, and then we have texture filtering, which allows us to adjust it even further, so crisp to smooth. And then it'll overall just blur out our entire animation. And our subrays per pixel will also affect our overall render quality. And of course, faster and better, really depending on what you need. But of course, better is always going to increase your render times. So there are a lot of different things we can use to adjust the overall quality of our fire. But basically, since we're using motion blur, and if we take a look at our preview frame here on the right, you can tell it's a lot more crisp than what we have with our actual animation preview on the bottom, and that's because our animation preview is using motion blur, whereas our main preview right here really isn't taking that into account. But we can tell it looks much better with motion blur, although we might want to decrease the overall blur. And if we decrease that amount and it still looks a little grainy, we can always adjust the effects quality within the actual material. So we could save out this material, we could apply this to other objects. You could do an elongated box and have a big wall of flames. You can create a new meta blob. We can animate these individual objects. We can add other sections to this object to shape out our fire a little bit more. So there's really a lot we can do with it, and I hope you understand now how we can really easily make fire in all of the different settings that are really a big part of it for all of our volumetric stuff, and getting it to look as realistic as possible. And we can always connect things to our altitude and slope and all of the other different options for controlling color and density, and just using all of those different functions that are available. Also applying math nodes will give us really neat looking effects, and we can adjust our flames however we want, because different size flames and different objects that will be on fire are going to really produce some different results, and you will need to vary those different settings. So just adjusting your scale won't always work, but with the base settings set, you can pretty much save this and apply this to basically any material, and then adjust where needed. And using fuzziness or the depth field is really important, because different objects will really need one or the other. And then you can always set up a function for that fuzziness as well to get different types of effects, and you end up with a really neat looking fire animation. And we could always change the rotation a little bit more and edit all those other options. Use something instead of a fractal node for something a little bit different. But overall, we've created some pretty realistic and interesting looking fire.